Welcome to part 9 of Learning to Learn at Home. Fear is the Mind Killer. This is the second to last video in this initial series of 10 videos. And in this episode we're going to look at this idea of fear and this widespread phenomenon of fear of failure that's really endemic within our school system. And that's not really surprising because there's lots of things that children encounter for the first time in their lives when they're at school that are really quite daunting. The idea of doing public speaking, there have been surveys done where people are asked to rank their fears, and amazingly, people rank their fear of public speaking higher than their fear of death, which is incredible, isn't it? As Jerry Seinfeld pointed out, that means that if they went to a funeral, they would rather be in the coffin than be delivering the eulogy. And it's actually quite easy to remember what it was like. I can remember being terrified of public speaking when I was younger. Now I don't really give it a second thought, but I used to be really scared of it. Many children say that they're afraid to raise their hand and contribute to class discussions, and that could be because they're afraid of getting something wrong, or it could be that they're afraid of what their peers will say about them if they are seen to be too keen, say, and they're putting their hand up to answer the teacher's questions. And fear of failure in exams is very widespread as well. Anxiety around exams is a huge thing, and a fear of failure is understandably a big part of that because, there are high stakes exams. And in each of these cases, the fear of failure can be really paralyzing because it stops you from doing stuff. Fear of failure stops you from trying to get involved in public speaking, stops you from putting your hand up, stops you from fulfilling your potential in exams. I remember in my A-level maths exam, the girl who was sitting next to me in the exam hall was a brilliant mathematician, but she was so worked up because this was her A-level exam that she couldn't even write her name on the paper for about 20 minutes. And she really suffered as a consequence because of how fearful she was that she might not perform. It was actually stopping her from being able to perform. And so fear is really, really powerful in some sense, but it's a strange thing, fear, because it's also surprisingly fragile, because when we face our fears, they just crumble. This is something that psychotherapists have known for years, something called exposure therapy, that when somebody's really terrified of something, if you expose them to that fear, it needs to be done carefully. You can't do it against somebody's will, but if you expose them to what they're afraid of, you can very quickly find that that fear dissipates. There are many brilliant quotes about fear, and one of my favourites is by J.K. Rowling, who talks about failure a lot. And she said that some failure in life is inevitable. It is impossible to live without failing at something, unless you live so cautiously that you might as well have not lived at all, in which case you fail by default. I think that that's absolutely brilliant because it sums up how self-defeating a fear of failure is and how it just keeps you in a box. It makes you small. It stops you from becoming more fully yourself. It stops you from self-actualizing, and that in itself is failing. So I think that that's an absolutely brilliantly insightful quote. And the second quote is where the title of our book comes from, Fear is the Mind Killer. So there's a book called Dune by the science fiction writer Frank Herbert. And in Dune there's this kind of a political and religious order of wise women called the Bene Gesserit. And the Bene Gesserit have this mantra that they repeat to themselves over and over in times of peril. It's called the Litany Against Fear. And it goes like this: I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. The reason that I love that quote so much is that that really gets to the heart of this. All of the ideas that we've talked about in this series have often been like sort of little tips and tools and strategies and thinking about thinking tools and systems for organizing information and so on. But underneath all of that, your attitude towards learning is fundamentally an emotional one. And when you overcome these fears, it's like you grow into that space where the fear was. So this is about education that's about more than just learning knowledge and skills and passing exams. This is a vision of education that's about becoming more fully yourself, about self-actualizing and becoming the best version of yourself that you can be. So how do we get there? How do we get to the point where children can embrace failure and recognize failure for what it is, which is just feedback in wolf's clothing, really? The answer to that question is that you keep it in focus. You talk about it and you expose it to the light, and you do so regularly. There's this fantastic little exercise that was shared with me by a teacher called David Cole. David, if you happen to see this, thank you for this. I'm not going to read through all these now, but it's essentially a series of questions that starts and ends with, what does the word failure mean to you? And when you run through this series of questions with children, you find that they answer that question very differently once they've thought about failure and what it means to make mistakes from all of these different perspectives. It's a really lovely little activity for helping children to change their perceptions of failure and to see it for what it is. But the most important thing is to keep failure in focus, to keep talking about it. The more we talk about it, the more the fear diminishes. To finish off, we're going to recap what we've covered in this course so far. If you remember back to the first video, we talked about mapping the journey, thinking really clearly about where we are and where we want to be. We then shared with you an idea for a quick win, the Who Am I project. It's a really good time now to reflect on that. What have you learned so far from this project? What have you learned about your child? And what have you noticed? What are they good at? What are they not so good at yet? Then we looked at taking control of the nervous system. These two ideas, monitor and control, this is really how we get to where we're going. You first of all pay attention, you notice stuff, and then through noticing it, you find where the levers are. And in terms of when we were feeling overwhelmed emotionally, we have a number of manual override levers, the mind, the body, and the breath, and we find activities that work for us. Then we looked at the parent-adult-child model and figuring out ways to make it so that more of our interactions with our children are happening on an adult-to-adult level, so that we're disrupting that parent-child dynamic. And if you remember, we talked about some adult moves about being proactive, being present and authentic, and just taking one thing at a time. Then we talked about scaffolding and that big idea as to how we set up systems to help our children run their lives and how to set about what they want to learn, when they want to learn it. That support includes things like ground rules, systems and routines, and then we gradually withdraw that support over time so that they can stand on their own 2 feet. Next, Kate talked about focusing on the how of learning and how essentially learning to learn is a process of taking the invisible processes of learning and making them explicit. And we can do that through questioning our children at 4 different levels, asking them to think about their thoughts, their emotions, their behaviors, and learning itself. Then I shared with you some tools for self-directed learning, the characteristics of effective learners, the 5 questions, a super powerful method for figuring out where you want to get to and how you're going to get there, and thinking about how to plan to overcome the obstacles and challenges that we will inevitably face along the way and planning to overcome those in advance. Then we looked at steps to success, where we're working with our children to agree what does each step along this journey look like, and that's a really nice way to make it clear that the gradient is really smooth between where we are and where we want to be. And it's also something that you can use as a coaching tool to think, where are you now? Where are you on a good day? Where are you on a not so good day? Where are you on average? What's it going to take for you to get to this next stage, and so on, so that you can make that transition really smooth. And then today we looked at failure and the importance of keeping failure in focus and recognizing it for what it is, which is just a necessary part of life. It's feedback. In the final video in this initial sequence of 10, Kate's going to share with you some fantastic ideas for project-based learning, and this is where we really start to get this baby off the ground. We start cooking on gas. So, thank you once again for your attention and for sticking with the course so far. Please do let us know how you're getting on. We look forward to hearing from you. Until next time, take care.